Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really powerful and, let's face it, often quite shadowy organization.
Hmm.
The Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. You know it as the FSB.
Mm-hmm.
You've shared a detailed PDF source with us. And our mission today is basically to pull out the most important, the most interesting bits to give you a clearer picture of what this agency is and, how it works.
Okay, let's get right into it then. The FSB, most people just use the acronym, but the full Russian name is Successor.
Right.
And that basically translates to Federal Service of Safety. It was officially set up on April 3rd, 1995. That date's pretty significant in the timeline of Russia's security services.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember, like you said, the FSB didn't just pop up out of nowhere.
Not at all.
It's the main successor agency to the Soviet Union's KGB, that KGB, an organization with a huge, long history. And its direct predecessor was the FSK, the Federal Counterintelligence Service. So, yeah, deep roots there.
And what's really interesting about that lineage, the source points this out, is when the KGB was broken up in 91, not everything ended up under the FSB umbrella.
Oh, right.
The Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, they handle spying abroad that stayed separate.
Hey, Doc.
And so did the FSO, the Federal Protective Service. They protect the top officials. And then there's this other one, the Main Directorate of Special Programs of the President, which sounds pretty clandestine.
Huh. So that initial split tells you something about how they restructured power after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Definitely.
So what does the FSB actually do day to day? The source says its scope is pretty broad.
It really is. Inside Russia, its main jobs are counterintelligence, internal security, border security too, counterterrorism, surveillance. Lots of surveillance. And investigating, serious crimes and breaches of federal law.
So a whole spectrum of security stuff within the country.
Absolutely. And its headquarters, Lubyanka Square, Moscow.
The same building, right. The old KGB main building.
Exactly. That physical continuity, that location, it really underlines the historical weight, the symbolism attached to the FSB.
And the leadership. The director's role is key, isn't it?
Hugely. Appointed by the president, answers directly to the president. That direct line says a lot about how close the agency is to the very top of Russian political power.
So, thinking bigger picture, the document makes it clear the FSB isn't just some technical security body.
No, far from it.
It has massive influence within the Russian executive branch. It's a major player shaping the country's internal dynamics.
Yeah, significant force.
Okay, so let's trace how this powerful organization actually, came about.
Yeah.
The source talks about the KGB being dismantled in November 91. That was right after the attempted coup, wasn't it?
That's right. Must have been a chaotic time for the security services. Intense reorganization.
I bet.
So right after that, December 91, they carve out two main intelligence functions from the old KGB. You get the SVR, focusing outside Russia, and FAPSI, which handled government communications, signals intelligence, that kind of thing.
And both reported straight to the president.
Yep. Shows a move to centralized control right from the start.
Then, January 92, the Ministry of Security gets created. So, another new entity.
Right. Taking over domestic security, border security, kind of splitting up the old KGB pie even further.
But that didn't stick for long, did it?
No, things were still turbulent. So, December 93, after more political upheaval, that ministry gets reorganized again, becomes the Federal Counterintelligence Service, the FSK.
Headed by Sergei Stepey.
That's the one. And the FSK wasn't just, reactive. The source mentions it was involved in covert stuff against Chechen separatists even before the first Chechen war kicked off. So playing an active internal security role.
Okay, so the FSK was this crucial middle step.
Okay.
Then, April 95, our source says the FSK gets formally renamed and reorganized, becomes the FSB Federal Law on the Federal Security Service. Sounds more official. Maybe a broader mandate.
That seems to be the case, and it kept evolving.
Yeah.
There was a decree, number 633, in June 95. That laid out more specific tasks, gave the FSB big responsibilities in cryptography work, which is huge. And it also increased the number of deputy directors. Suggests it was already getting bigger, more complex.
And the first director of this new FSB,
Mikhail Ivanovich Barsukov, appointed under Yeltsin.
now Vladimir Putin, a name everyone knows. The document mentions his time as FSB director, 98 to 99. It was short, but sounds like it was really significant.
Very significant. The source really emphasizes this. Putin, even though apparently he wasn't keen on the job at first, pushed through a massive reorganization.
Really?
Yeah, a big shakeup at the top, dismissed a lot of the senior personnel. Seems like that period really set the stage for where the FSB was headed.
And then he became prime minister, and Patrushev took over the FSB in '99.
Nikolai Patrushev, yeah, stayed there for a long time.
Okay, moving into the early 2000s, our deep dive shows the FSB's power really ballooned then. 2003 seems like a key year.
It was huge. Two massive organizations got folded into the FSB. First, the Border Guard Service. Think about that 210,000 staff.
No.
Huge. And second, a big chunk of FAPSI that signals intelligence agency, including its operations targeting former Soviet republics.
So a massive jump in manpower and, well, its reach, especially in neighboring countries.
Definitely. And what's really notable there is the contrast with the SVR, the foreign intelligence guys.
Also.
Well, back in '92, the SVR had apparently agreed not to spy on those former Soviet states, but the FSB, no such agreement. So when they absorbed that part of FAPSI in 2003, they effectively got a much wider intelligence mandate right in Russia's backyard. Could have created some overlap or maybe a new division of labor.
Interesting. So why this big power-up for the FSB around then? What were the drivers?
The source points to a few things. One, the rising threat of terrorism was a major factor.
Right.
Two, a desire to sort out the infighting and duplicated effort between the FSB, FAPSI, and the border guards. They were apparently tripping over each other.
Makes sense.
And third, needing a more unified response to transnational crime, drugs, weapons trafficking, that sort of thing.
In the political angle, Putin was relatively new as president then.
Exactly. The document suggests the FSB was a key power base for him. So consolidating these agencies in 2003 probably helped shore up his authority within the whole government structure, too.
So after becoming president, Putin kept shaping the FSB. Our source mentions reforms starting May 2000, putting the FSB directly under presidential control.
Yeah, cementing that close link between the agency and the head of state.
And the internal structure changed, too.
A decree in June 2000 set up a new hierarchy. You had the director, a first deputy director, and then 9 other deputy directors, each overseeing key areas like economic security, counterintelligence, and this big one, protection of the constitutional system and counterterrorism.
Quite the mouthful.
It is. And by 2008, the source says the agency had 9 distinct divisions, each specialized.
Okay, let's talk counterterrorism. That's obviously a huge part of the FSB's job. The source mentions the command shifting back and forth in Chechnya.
Yeah, that's interesting. First, in 2001, after the main military push, control of federal forces there shifted from the military to the FSB.
Yeah.
But then, in 2003, it shifted back again to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the MVD. Seems like they were constantly tweaking the command structure, trying to figure out what worked best.
And the FSB's Special Forces units, Alpha and Vimpel, they were involved in those awful hostage crises, right? Moscow Theater, Beslan School.
They were. The source highlights their role, but it also notes, importantly, that how those situations were handled drew a lot of public criticism, especially concerning the high number of civilian deaths.
Yeah, those were terrible. But on the counterterrorism front, the document does mention a success, getting Shamil Basayev in 2006.
Right. Basayev, the Chechen leader behind Beslan and loads of other attacks, the FSB took him out, reportedly after a 6-month operation involving stepping up activity in countries supplying arms to the militants.
And the overall trend in attacks.
Well, the source suggests a drop towards the end of Putin's second term as president. But then, sadly, a resurgence starting around 2009. And that led to the 2010 Moscow metro bombings. Just a horrible reminder that the threat hadn't gone away.
And the government response to that resurgence? More power for the FSB.
It seems so. July 2010, President Medvedev, who was in office then, gave FSB officers new powers. They could issue official warnings to people about actions that might lead to crimes.
Warnings?
Yeah, and even detain people for up to 15 days if they didn't comply with FSB orders. The source notes, predictably, human rights groups weren't happy about that.
Understandable. Okay, let's shift focus now to Ukraine. Our deep dive shows the FSB was heavily involved there well before the 2022 invasion, going back to 2014 at least.
Definitely. I mean, other agencies like the SVR and GRU were involved too, but the FSB, especially its 5th service, seems to have had the lead role in intelligence gathering and influence operations.
The 5th service, that sounds important. What exactly is it?
The source describes its focus as counterintelligence in former Soviet countries. It apparently mirrors the old KGB's 5th Directorate function. And within that 5th Service, there's a specific part, the 9th Directorate, focused just on Ukraine.
Okay.
And personnel numbers in that Ukraine directorate reportedly shot up significantly in the run-up to the 2022 invasion, suggests a real strategic focus on Ukraine.
And what's really striking, the source mentions intelligence, suggesting the FSB was actually drawing up plans to replace Ukraine's elected leaders.
Yeah, with pro-Russian figures based in Russia, it indicates a very deep level of strategic planning aimed at reshaping Ukraine's whole political system.
But it seems there were some major miscalculations along the way.
That's putting it mildly. The document cites reports, apparently from a Russian military analyst, claiming the FSB fed Putin bad intel back in 2014.
Bad intel how?
Suggesting that a Russian takeover of Crimea would be widely welcomed. And then, tragically, similar assurances of a quick, easy victory were supposedly given just before the big 2022 invasion.
And during the invasion itself, reports of FSB operational failures.
Yeah, quite a few. The source mentions problems with their encrypted communication systems, which is pretty basic stuff. And even worse, allegations that FSB intelligence was actually leaking to the Ukrainians.
Wow.
And then Ukrainian intelligence apparently dumped the personal details of hundreds of alleged FSB agents online. A massive security breach, if true.
So after these setbacks, reports started coming out suggesting Putin wasn't happy with the FSB, especially that 5th Service.
Right. Our deep dive mentions alleged house arrests, even dismissals of senior figures within the agency. Sounds like major internal fallout over the perceived intelligence failures.
And beyond just the invasion failures, the source paints a broader picture from some reports, doesn't it? Characterizing the FSB as, well, corrupt, bureaucratic.
Yeah, and out of touch. There were even alleged leaks from FSB analysts themselves, claiming they were pressured to write rosy reports about Russia's chances, regardless of the actual situation on the ground.
Okay, let's pivot back to more traditional intelligence stuff. Espionage, counterintelligence. The document gives some numbers.
It does. Back in 2011, the FSB claimed they had exposed a large number of foreign spies. The director at the time, Kovalyov, apparently compared the figure to World War II levels, suggests it's seen as a constant, intense struggle.
In specific cases.
Yeah, the source gives examples, often involving scientists or engineers accused of selling sensitive military or tech secrets. And then there's the FSB's legal power, since 2006, to carry out targeted killings of terror suspects overseas. That shows their global reach.
And we shouldn't forget about the borders. The border guard service coming into the FSB in 2003. Russia's borders are just vast.
Immense land and sea borders. So border protection is a massive, complex job in itself.
Now, shifting to the digital world, cyber stuff, surveillance. The FSB's heavily involved there too.
Oh yeah. They have a hand in shaping Russia's export control strategy, which covers tech with dual civilian and military uses.
And those WikiLeaks, Spy Files Russia, they revealed quite a bit about FSB surveillance, didn't they?
Yeah.
They did. The SORM system. It sounds pretty comprehensive. SORM 1 for phones, SORM 2 for internet traffic, and then SORM 3, which the source describes as real-time, total monitoring. Paints a picture of, very extensive digital surveillance inside Russia.
And beyond surveillance, offensive cyber ops, foreign intelligence gathering online.
The FSB's role there has grown significantly too, according to the source. It mentions various hacker groups attributed to the FSB, Berserk Bear, Energetic Bear, those kinds of names.
Right.
Apparently coordinated by specific FSB units, the 16th and 18th centers. And you have that U.S. indictment of FSB officers over the big Yahoo data breach, shows the international impact of their cyber activities.
The source also mentions reports that the FSB can create its own malware and has links to criminal hackers.
Yeah, it suggests a complex ecosystem, potentially blurring the lines between state actors and cyber criminals.
Okay, let's quickly touch on the structure and leadership. Who's in charge now?
According to our source, the current director is Alexander Bortnikov. First deputy director is Sergei Korolev. And the head of the scientific and technical service is Eduard Chernovoltsev.
And it's not just a Moscow thing, right? They have offices everywhere.
All across Russia, regional offices in every federal subject, plus special units within the military. The document gives some examples of department heads at the federal level, too, gives you a sense of the internal breakdown.
And that St. Petersburg directorate seems historically important.
Very. The source points out that a lot of high-profile figures, including Putin and Patrushev, came up through the St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast Directorate. Seems like a real incubator for future leaders. The source also lists all the FSB directors since '95, which is useful for historical context.
Right. Now, We have to talk about the criticisms and controversies. They followed the FSB pretty much constantly.
Yeah, it's unavoidable. The deep dive summarizes the main ones. Allegations of corruption, human rights abuses, acting like a secret police force, crushing dissent.
The Alexander Litvinenko poisoning in 2006 with polonium stands out, especially given his accusations against the FSB before he died.
A very stark example. And then there are those incredibly controversial, highly debated claims linking the FSB to the 1999 apartment bombings. The idea that it might have been a false flag operation is still discussed, though heavily contested.
The FSB's also faced criticism over how it handles Islamist terrorism. And that's sociologist Olga Kristianovskaya, her assessment that the FSB basically dominates Russian life, that raises red flags for many observers.
Definitely. And since the Crimea annexation, you've got serious allegations documented by groups like the UN forced disappearances, torture, politically motivated prosecutions, especially targeting Crimean Tatars and pro-Ukrainian voices. The source even mentions alleged sexual violence by FSB officers during interrogations.
There's also the surveillance of Jehovah's Witnesses who are banned in Russia.
Right, and this recurring theme of FSB officers getting caught up in corruption scandals, illegal business takeovers, it raises serious questions about accountability, abuse of power.
Internationally, too. Those U.S. sanctions related to FSB cyber activity during the 2016 U.S. election.
Yep. And more recently, those investigations by Bellingcat and The Insider pointing the finger at FSB agents for poisoning Alexei Navalny, that caused a huge international outcry.
During the 2022 invasion, those reports about FSB involvement in filtration activities in places like Mariupol, with allegations of severe human rights abuses.
Yes, very disturbing reports. And that Novaya Gazeta article linking suspicious deaths of businessmen to possible fraud involving Gazprom and people with alleged FSB ties, it just adds another layer of concern about potential illicit activities.
Then there was the whole Russian doping scandal. The FSB popped up there too, didn't it?
It did. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WODR, their investigation found evidence of FSB influence over the Moscow anti-doping lab. Allegations of bugging the place, telling staff not to cooperate.
And even direct involvement in swapping samples.
That was the claim, yeah. FSB members allegedly swapping dirty urine samples for clean ones.
Which led to Russia's suspension from international athletics.
Right. The McLaren reports went further, describing this state-directed fail-safe system. Involved the Ministry of Sport, the FSB, the Moscow lab, all allegedly working together to cover up doping by Russian athletes.
Including setting up a clean urine bank during the Sochi Olympics at an FSB command center.
That was the allegation. An extraordinary level of state-orchestrated cheating, if true.
Okay, and finally, we need to cover the Crocus City Hall attack. Very recent, March 2024.
Yeah, our deep dive notes the warnings beforehand. Both the U.S. and Iran apparently warned Moscow about an impending terror attack.
Warnings that Putin dismissed publicly as provocative.
Tragically, yes. And then the attack happened, March 22nd. ISIS-K attacked the concert hall. Huge number of casualties. ISIS-K claimed responsibility almost immediately.
But Putin and the FSB pointed fingers elsewhere.
They did. Made unsubstantiated claims linking Ukraine and, quote, Western special services to the attack, despite the ISIS-K claim. And then that disturbing video emerged, allegedly showing FSB agents torturing one of the suspects.
The aftermath brought more criticism of the FSB, didn't it?
It did. Associates of Navalny, Novaya Gazeta Europe, they basically accused the FSB of incompetence, of misallocating resources, arguing that focusing so much on political opposition and the war in Ukraine maybe left them blind to the real terrorist threat.
And one more recent event mentioned in the source, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast in August 2024.
Right. Ukrainian forces crossed the border, apparently occupied some areas temporarily.
And since the FSB's border guard service is responsible for border security.
Exactly. It raised serious questions. Reports suggested the border there was mainly defended by young, inexperienced FSB conscripts and lightly armed infantry. Why? Because the better units were supposedly deployed in Ukraine.
Leading to heavy Russian losses, reports of some conscripts being unarmed.
That was reported, yes, highlighting potential vulnerabilities and resource allocation issues.
So wrapping up this deep dive on the FSB, we've seen its KGB roots, its evolution into this huge, powerful agency with, well, fingers in many pies.
Yeah, vast responsibilities, complex structure.
Involved in so many major events, domestically and internationally, and of course dogged by constant criticism and controversy.
And again, just to be clear, this whole overview is drawn solely from the information in the document you provided us.
Right. So finally, maybe some food for thought for you, the listener. When you consider this long history, these wide-ranging powers of the FSB, What does it tell us about Russia's internal political dynamics? How does it shape Russia's relationship with the rest of the world?
And maybe more broadly, what questions does all this raise for you about security agencies in general, their nature, their influence in different political systems across the globe?
Definitely something to think about. That concludes this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.